Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Definitely appreciate your time, your energy, and your effort in being with us today. My name is DeJuan Baker. I serve as the Associate Athletic Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here for the CU Buffs. Very excited to bring this panel to you all today as the moderator. With me, I have a number of esteemed colleagues, friends, and just wonderful people. So I'm really excited to get the opportunity to kind of share the stage with them. I'll go through and give a brief description of the session and also introduce all of our speakers, and then afterwards we'll get into some of the questions. If you do have questions, there's a microphone in the middle of the floor that is on a microphone stand. It is blue. At the end of the session, please walk up and form a line so that you can ask your questions, and we'll be sure to ask those and answer those in the appropriate form and timing. In addition, for those that are joining us via Zoom, Ty, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for kicking our session off. Ty will also be taking questions in the chat via Zoom as well. We also have an ASL interpreter, and we also have live captioning via the Zoom as well if anybody is in need of those services. So as we get started, just a brief description of the session. We have a list of individuals, or a collection of individuals specifically from the United States Olympic and Paralympic committees who will be sharing and discussing their DEI efforts and collaborating with practitioners at the USOPC and the national governing bodies. These individuals will have a conversation about inclusion in Olympic sport and the challenges, opportunities, and trends in inclusion in sport, and how diversity, equity, and inclusion appears both in sport nationally and internationally. First, I have to my immediate left, I have Leland Brown, III. Leland is a native of Galveston Island, Texas, and is the first director for diversity, equity, and inclusion at USA Swimming. He's earned his bachelor's degree at Bethel College in Kansas with Bethel College, sorry about that, Leland, with 3 majors: English, Communication Arts, and Teacher Education. While in college, Leland was the captain and MVP of the Thresher football team. He was a soloist in an Emmy-awarded concert choir and performed in several theater productions, including The Jungle Book, Othello, and The Man of La Mancha, and was an award-winning speech and debater. Upon graduating from college, Leland has pursued a professional career in creating access to higher education and self-empowerment, traditionally for underserved, undervalued, and marginalized communities. As I mentioned, he currently serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for USA Swimming. Thanks for joining us, Leland. Next, I have David Lipscomb. David has spent over 25 years at the highest levels of cycling and martial arts, and brings more than 10 years of leadership and organizational development expertise. He was an early advocate for DEI initiatives, having been the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion for Sovereign Bank in 2009. In that role, he authored the bank's first ever diversity playbook. Lipscomb recently conducted the first of an ongoing series of cycling inclusion conference talks conceived by USA Cycling. Today, Lipscomb is the CEO and head coach of the New York-based CIS Training Systems, a cycling performance organization that focuses on coaching in the widest possible sense to drive personal, professional, and organizational performance and success. Thanks for joining us, David. Next, I have Megan Ritch. Megan is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access Senior Manager at USA Triathlon. She has been with USA Triathlon since 2012, focusing on specifically diversity, equity, and inclusion and access since 2017. In her current role, Megan manages program development and focuses on growing women's engagement in multisport, building USA's Triathlon's Together We Thrive initiative, inclusive policy development for transgender and gender non-binary inclusion, and also serves as the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access Resource Development and DEIA-focused HR practices. Thanks for joining us, Megan. And then lastly, I have with me Yannick Kluch. Yannick Kluch serves as an assistant professor and director of outreach for inclusive excellence in the Center for Sport Leadership at Virginia Commonwealth University, also known as VCU. Dr. Kluch's research is focused on utilizing the potential of sport as a vehicle for inclusive leadership and social change, as well as eliminating barriers to social justice in sport. Specifically, his areas of expertise include cultural studies of sport, athlete activism, sport policy, and equity, diversity, and inclusion in U.S. and global sport. His research has been published in numerous journals. In addition to his research, Dr. Kluch frequently serves as a consultant on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, most recently for the NCAA, USA Diving, and the Women's Collegiate Gymnastic Association. And in 2020, he was one of only 4 U.S. thought leaders to be appointed to the inaugural Team USA Council on Racial and Social Justice by the USOPC. Thank you for joining us, Yannick. So with these collection of individuals, we really want to have a conversation about what DEI looks like specifically at the Olympic, both nationally and internationally. And so I want to kick it over to our panelists to just give us a little information and really to start us out with just what is the state of DEI in sport today and how has the industry embraced or not embraced DEI specifically in sport?
That's a loaded question, right? So I think specifically for my community, when I first got into USA Swimming, the first thing I did was a listening tour. And I learned that from one of my mentors at the NCAA, Dr. Catrice Albert, who would take her time the first 3 months, 4 months, 6 months of the job, just getting to know the stakeholders or the people within the community. Because we found too often that we were solving problems for people without them being in the room. So we were always missing the mark, because we didn't actually know what success looked like for the communities that we were bringing programs to, that we were bringing education to. So we had to include them in that conversation. So first 6 months of the job, I actually had over 175 conversations that went to about 2 to 3 conversations a day, and understanding DEI and the needs within this community, the barriers, the challenges within this community started there. Just listening. And we often don't do that enough as leaders because of confirmation bias, right? Or affinity bias, or like our intelligence bias, in which we think, right, we have the answers, right? Or we've worked hard at it. And so it was just listening first. And what derived from that was 2 large things. First, COVID disconnected us, and there was a COVID deficit that we were all battling. There was Zoom fatigue happening. There was COVID fatigue, in which like you were ready to engage with your friends, but like an hour was just draining, right? Y'all have been there after COVID where it's like, you were really looking forward to hanging out with your friends or right doing this conference, but it just drained you because you're not used to being in this environment anymore, right? I say all of that to say, first was COVID deficit. We had to get back to engaging and actually being where the need was. The second piece that we found out was people didn't really understand DEI. It was like this foreign words. What does diversity, inclusion, and equity even mean? And like, let's go further. What do these 3 words mean in practice? Wow. Because we could talk about diversity and like the theory of it. Oh, it's a lot of people in a room that look different, or right, they have different orientation, sex, gender expression, right? We can talk about that. But what does it look like in action? Inclusion, what does that look like in action? People had no clue, and they thought DEI equated to like just LGBTQ work and black work. How many people can raise their hand and they've heard that before? How many people have heard that before, that DEI work means black or gay work, right? And so we had to demythify that. We had to just take away those misnomers, and that's a challenge and a barrier within the sport that we embraced as well. So COVID deficit, but then also understanding what DEI means, and we'll get to that later.
Well, I'll just say this. I think one of the unique challenges that we're faced with USA Cycling is the following. It is a predominantly white sport. We all get it. We all understand that. So the first, I would say, just like you, the first 3 months of my tenure there, and I started in October of last year, was to get my arms around the organization, because my experience comes from a leadership development organization and understanding around how to get your arms around something. I think one of the unique problems that we have is everybody kind of knows what they think they want to know, but they really don't know anything, truth be told. So part of my job is to help educate people on what is the real conversation around DEI. What does it really mean for the organization? And every organization is different. Okay, I want you to understand that. Every organization is different. Every college is different, right? So one of the things we have to understand is, how do we get in a room and talk about the real issues that are faced with us today? And you hit it right on the money. COVID has locked people down. And that's what the real conversation is. And how do we get past that whole mindset and get people to work, right? Because that's the problem. It's real easy now, because since, I call it the idiot box, but it's the truth. We're all faced around in front of the computer, so we really don't have any more interaction with people like we used to have. When I used to work in diversity back in 2003, I've been in this work for 20 years. Damn, 20 years, it's been a long time. 20 years. But what I've learned and I understood in coming in the organization was, how do I get my arms around this ability to change an environment based around what people think they know, what they don't know? And the hardest part was to get the leadership team to understand why I exist. Why am I actually here to help do what we're supposed to do from an organizational standpoint, and how we engage a community of cyclists who understand that we do want to grow, we do want to create some types of value. So one of the toughest parts that I'm now faced with is, how do I get my arms around the organization, one? Number two is getting the right constituents to understand the value of the work, and truly, how does it impact the bottom line? Because at the end of the day, if we're not doing what we're supposed to do for our customers, we're not doing what we're supposed to do for our customers, and in the sense of that, we're not making money, truth be told.
Along the same lines, so we at USA Triathlon have been fortunate to have been focusing on diversity and inclusion since 2017. So it's something that we kind of are playing the long game with. We have initially had a lot of issues with buy-in from some of our athletes, but that's okay. We don't want someone to be part of our sport who doesn't want to progress and be inclusive of everyone. I mean, we have an HBCU program for our NCAA athletes. And the first time we announced one of the schools that were part of the program, we got a ton of hate mail, like, don't use my money for this. So we've come a long ways. DEIA, as we call it, we've added access for our para triathletes, because we find that it's really important that they have a word to represent them as well. We've come a really long ways. DEIA is part of our strategic plan. We have an operational plan that was implemented at the beginning of 2020 that guides our organization as a whole on how to include diversity and inclusion in everything that you're doing. We do annual roundtables, which is a valuable tool to hear from the community, the people that we're serving. And I think the biggest thing that has helped us move forward is that we've been able to get our leadership to accept that DEIA is not a feel-good program, but it's a good business practice. So in the past few years, I started in member relations doing DEIA, and now I'm sitting in the strategic and growth department, because that's where we can get DEIA in every area of the organization. We can have our growth initiatives have a diversity and inclusion focus. So yeah, getting buy-in, educating our leadership that it is good business. This is why we need to do it. We can't miss out on whole populations of people.
Awesome. I want to preface my response with, I have a very different role than these three folks. So I'm kind of the external consultant. So I look at the big picture questions, looking at barriers in US Olympic sport generally. So I completely agree with you. I loved what you said about the business case for DEI. I think when we think about the current state of DEI, we're kind of moving beyond that business case, because when we talk about the business case for DEI, that DEI is good for business, we are implying that if it weren't good, we shouldn't be doing it. And I think all of us agree that there's an ethical commitment to DEI. Even if it would suck for our business, still working with people, we should make sure that everybody feels like they belong in our organization, as long as they want to be inclusive. So that's the one thing. I think when we think about the state of DEI in sport right now, not just in the US, but globally, we are coming off of two of the probably most energizing years of talking about DEI. And in my work, I don't talk as much about DEI. I look really at justice and belonging, and barriers to racial and social justice, and how DEI fit into those. And sometimes DEI is used as a euphemism to talk about racial justice or racial injustice or social injustice. So I think a good thing that we're at right now is that we're talking about DEI, that we're talking about racial and social justice in sports like swimming, triathlon, cycling, hockey, that historically haven't been at the forefront, even though you all have done some really good work, especially in triathlon. I think the downside is that we are coming off of this wave of energy, and we can already feel that the momentum is waning away. So we kind of want to make sure, as people committed to DEI, how do we keep that momentum going? How do we create the structures so we don't need, these horrific murders of Black and brown Americans from happening for us to even think about those things? So how can we create the structures and be proactive rather than reactive to make sure that everybody can feel like they belong in the organizations we create within sport? I feel like I'm going to be the downer on this panel, but
I'll add a comment. Yannick, I'm gonna stay with you for the next question, but I'll add a quick comment specifically to what the state of DEI is in sport today. And things that I heard them consistently say is, despite all this action, despite all this momentum, there's still a consistent question of, what are you doing? Why are you here, right? And I think that's something as DEI practitioners will probably, unfortunately, always face, but it's really, really important to always continuously educate what we do, why we do it, why it's important. And similar to Yannick's point, hey, the business case is obviously extremely important, but at the core of this is we should be good people, and this is good people work, essentially. And so we've also seen, specifically from the NCAA, there's been a bevy of roles, and I'll kind of use myself as an example. Over the past year, without 2020, DeJuan Baker probably isn't at CU, right? So there have been things that have really helped us as practitioners to really be able to get into spaces that are really, really helpful to get us to do the work that is really necessary to change who we are as people, as organizations, as teams, as departments. And I'm going to transition, specifically talking to things that we work on. I'm going to ask you to start, Yannick, since you have the microphone. But what are things that you're working on the most right now? Give us a brief overview or description of what your role looks like, but also what are things that are really pressing to you as an individual or to the organization you work with to advance DEI in sport?
yeah, so my day job is that of a professor at VCU, and I brought some of my VCU students. I want to give a shout out to them over there. But I'm also a DEI strategist and consultant, so I work with organizations that bring me in and think about how can we identify barriers to racial and social justice, to DEI, and hopefully eliminate those barriers. Most recently, you mentioned that in your intro, I was one of the experts appointed to the Team USA Council on Racial and Social Justice. That was a group that brought together 40 Team USA current athletes and alumni, including people like Gwen Berry and Dr. John Carlos, who, if you know anything about the history of protests in sport, is a huge figure. And I've been kind of working as an external expert on protests and demonstrations in the Olympic and Paralympic movement, which that's one of my focus areas of my work, looking at activism, looking at thinking about how can we empower athletes to drive change, to use the platforms that they have in raising awareness and creating action towards a more racially just and socially just world. So on the council, I've been working primarily on Rule 50, which those of you who have followed the Olympics, that's the rule that says you can't protest during the Olympic Games. There is also a counterpart on the Paralympic side called Section 2.2. So if I had to summarize my work over the last 2 years, it's trying to amend that rule or getting rid of the rule so we can have athletes have the freedom to speak up on the podium or anywhere in Olympic spaces to raise awareness for racial and social justice. You can imagine it has not been an easy 2 years. Most sports organizations don't agree, surprise. But thankfully, we've had some pretty historic changes on the US side. One of the things that came out of the council was a recommendation that we gave to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee that said that as an organization, as the USOPC, arguably one of the most powerful NLCs in the world, you should be taking a stronger stance on Rule 50 and empowering athletes to speak up on racial and social injustice, especially knowing that people like Dr. John Carlos, Tommy Smith are key figures in racial and social justice movements. And we published this 4-page recommendation coming out of the council, and the next day the USOPC announced that they will no longer sanction athletes speaking out on racial and social justice. So it was a pretty big historic moment for us. That's what I've been working on the past 2 years, and now it's, where do we move from there to taking it to the global level with the Beijing Games going on right now. I was doing some work behind the scenes with the Tokyo Games. So really looking at what are the policies in place that limit athlete freedom of expression, that limit racial and social justice, and how can we address those across the board.
Oh, yes. Same question. Do you want to stall? Okay. Yeah. So it's a great question. I feel like at USA Triathlon we divide our DEIA into 3 different areas. So we have HR, So right now we're working on revamping our hiring best practices as it relates to diversity and inclusion. So how we're recruiting staff members, how we're growing our interview pools, stuff like that. So kind of the important side that we haven't been doing in the past. So one is HR, two is the programming side. So our big push for programming right now is focused on resources. A lot of our constituents in our community, so our race directors, coaches, officials, clubs, their most requested item is resources on how to create a diverse environment, how to create an inclusive environment, anything related to DEIA. They're really craving it, which is such a positive. So right now, our team's working on building out a training. So it's a free training that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, but in a multi-sport or triathlon context. So instead of like the typical business training that you may go to on like examples in offices, these are all set in a sport setting. So we're really excited about that. It'll be something that we're hopefully launching next month. And then in programming, we're building a high performance program. So historically, our Olympic and Paralympic national teams have been predominantly white, and our pipelines are predominantly white. So we're working on ways to identify athletes of color who can be successful in our Olympic pipeline. So super exciting, definitely a gap that we've had, but we've been able to secure some funding for this program, so really pumped. Anytime we can get funding, it is a huge positive. And then the policy side is our third column. Obviously, if you're paying attention to the news, the NCAA's transgender policy put the kind of like the responsibility back on the NGBs. So we're working on that policy, as well as helping our international federation with their transgender policy, since the IOC did a similar thing. So that's a big focus for us in terms of policy right now, is transgender policy. We did just launch a non-binary participation policy at the beginning of middle of 2021. So we now have non-binary as a gender option for all of our athletes. We also have a non-binary rankings program, so our athletes who identify as non-binary can still have the same experience as athletes who identify in the binary. So one thing we're super excited about, we're getting ready to release our rankings in a couple weeks, so we're expecting some feedback from that, which those are always fun emails to respond to. But yeah, really positives.
Oh, wow. I guess we should go back a little bit. Now, I'll date myself a bit. So what Duran was saying, I was the creator of this diversity playbook. And one of the things I kind of figured out is there are 5 things that every organization must do. Okay, and it goes around every organization. It's how do you engage leadership across the board, be it the leadership environment. What about your workforce environment? What are you going to try to do in the workforce environment? What about the customer acquisition and retention, or retention and acquisition of your customer base? And the 4th thing would be, how does an organization actually learn to get better at what it does? And the lastly would be, what about your corporate social responsibility? Now, I was talking about these things in 2003, and we're still talking about the same things today, because every organization needs these components. So what my clear focus is, and what it has been since October, was to get the organization to wrap its arms around these 5 things. So 4 of those things I'm doing actually right now. The leadership side of the conversation around the board, and the workforce component is super critical, because as we know, cycling is an all-white sport. Got it, right? But now, this is interesting. We just kind of figured out that we know the same person that kind of came over to my organization that used to work at this organization. But the idea of workforce engagement is cultural competence, of understanding how people understand the work of diversity and inclusion, how it impacts the organization. It doesn't have to be about black and white. It has to be about the understanding of what does it actually mean to be in an environment that's culturally competent. So my job is to help this organization, USA Cycling, create an inclusion of an environment of inclusion, regardless of what color it is, right? So once I then say, okay, let's start bringing more people of color inside my organization, it can be supported. So what tends to happen is we put the cart before the horse sometimes. And we say, all right, you know what, we're gonna build this culture of inclusion, we're gonna bring more people of color inside the organization, more women inside the organization with no support. And then what tends to happen is what happens? It falls down because there's no support, there's no foundation. So when we talk about pillars, we've all heard about this focus of pillars, right? Pillars. Pillars create strength, right? So how do you create these pillars that create strength to ensure that we're doing the right things based around these 5 things I talked about before? So the last piece is I'm trying to get my organization, USA Cycling, to advocate for something. Because that's the key. Because if we want to go out to organizations and or communities of color to support what we're trying to do and create grassroots to elite level cycling, we need to advocate for something. So I think that's where the rubber really, really meets the road in getting people to understand that, hey, it's more than what you usually have done. The mindset of this foundation of, how can I say it, that we used to do business this way for years, we have to change that mindset in order to create change. So that's kind of what I'm focused on right now.
So my staff of 3 was dwindled down to a staff of 1.
That's you.
Yes, which means like 79 to 85-hour work weeks have been constant. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. And so you asked what I'm doing, a lot. But in my role as Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, my overarching goal was to create strategic direction for the organization and understanding what DEI work is, and not just what DEI work is, how it's enacted, how it's put into practice, how we can take these tenets and then actually enact steps every single day to committing to this work. So out of that, the strategic plan, in which now we're enacting and working on, and now is on me to implement, and currently hiring another employee, so they'll coordinate. If y'all are looking for a job, hit me up, all right? But with that, what we're doing first is we're engaging. First part of our plan is to engage. We have to engage externally and internally, right, to actually understand and analyze the needs of our staffs, our stakeholders, our members, our athletes, our parents, our officials. They all have different needs. And again, we must be at the table asking them if their needs, their favorite food, right? So that way, the dinner for them, right, once we get to the education or the elevation, that we know that we're meeting the mark. So first is engagement. But after we analyze and find out where the barriers exist, then we must educate internally and externally. So the next part of the plan is actually educating our staffs. We have equity-based trainings to help them understand DEI. We have nationwide trainings that start at the minimal level of what is the diversity mean in action, what does I mean in action, and E. So I'm gonna take a little break to just push that in, that education looks like diversity in action is not just being in a room of people that look different. My diversity isn't just that I belong to the Black community. My diversity is also I belong to the operatic community. Also, like, I belong to Emmy award-winning community. Also, I belong to the All-American community. Like, right? And so those are communities that you would never know I belong to unless you did what? Connected with me. So too often we're saying, oh, this room is diverse, and there's no connection happening. There's no action behind diversity happening in the room because nobody's actually talking. Nobody's getting to unpack, right, the identities that each other's hold, and we're not doing that diversity. So then when we look at inclusion, the piece of that education is inclusion is acceptance, but acceptance is different from approval. How do I know that? So like, I'm drippy, y'all. I said it. I'm drippy, and I show up to work like this, right? And sometimes people are like, I don't think I approve of how this guy dressed today. But right. I'm in a corporate setting, right? And y'all, I wear my platform boots. I'm talking about coming in black leather. I'm the guy. Hoodies on. Look, I'm going to be myself, right?
Think about it, because I wear a hat all the time. And, I used to come from that corporate environment. People say, okay, you have to wear a suit all the time. No, I'm wearing a hat all the time. Because it's not about what you look like, it's about what you do.
Well, inclusion starts with I.
Say it again.
And half of the time we forget ourselves. Y'all talk about we want to practice inclusion. You forgot I. I ain't forgetting myself at home. I'm showing up drippy.
I love that. That's awesome.
Hey, and I'm talking like this in every meeting. I'm showing up. I'm speaking who I am, right, into existence. But accepting me is not approving of me. So your approval is, I don't like the way that Leland dresses. So you don't like the way I dress, therefore you may disapprove of my thoughts. No, hold on.
Right.
No, you have to accept my thoughts. You leave your approval or disapproval at home. right? And so teaching that. But then the last piece is equity, y'all. And equity is a word, if you take it out of the definition, I have an English major, y'all heard that, and I learned like words from the beginning. I read the dictionary twice a year, and like equity is fairness. That's all it means. It's like projecting fairness. So the action behind equity is providing something, providing fairness. That's what it means, to provide something. And we say we're giving equity to people. We say we're doing DEI work, and we haven't provided anything. So now I look at people in our membership, and I say, put on your DEI cap. When you say that word DEI, if you didn't see any connection in the room, if you didn't see people accepting others, if you didn't see providing happen in that room, no cap. You ain't do DEI work. Because it's deeper than race, and it's deeper than LGBTQ, it's deeper than just work for gender. It's connecting, accepting, and providing for people at every facet of our society. Because when this work is so deep that you start to realize that even the majority is exclusionary because they're trying to provide for their own. They're trying to create a level of sanity as well. The inclusion looks exclusionary because taking care of themselves. And so we have to take DEI, make it extremely minimal when we're educating, and say, this is the work you can do every single day. You can connect with people, you can accept people, and you can provide for them. Keep doing that on repeat. Lastly, y'all, the two things we're doing is empowering. So after we educate, to empower actually means to equip with tools. So for our membership, especially the ones who are marginalized, women, LGBTQ, race, black BIPOC population, those who are in the lower socioeconomic status, those who are disabled, there's an information deficit. They don't have the information that others may harbor, able bodies may harbor, that those who are in the majority may harbor. And so it's my job to empower the people who are marginalized by giving them money, finances, but also giving them education to help them get where they need to go. So we'll be closing in up until the year 2028, just closed in, the department and USA Swimming owed, and shout out to them. We're gonna be giving out closer to $3 million up to the year of 2028 to impact communities in need, because swimming is the only sport that actually can save lives. Thank you. And then lastly, we're going to elevate the sport, you all. We're going to get better together. So we're going to engage, we're going to educate, we're going to empower, and we're going to elevate the sport.
Wow, now you keep that. That's the next question.
I'm going to add one thing, too. So my DEI staff is here, and I think they'll probably chuckle at this, but we here at CU in athletics just completed our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. And in that process, one of the things that we talked about that was so important for us was, hey, what's the root of this plan? What do we want people to get out of this? And the root for us was engagement. We wanted all of our staff, all of our student athletes to know there are people here who can engage in this work with you and how it looks. And so the first thing we say is, hey, meet with us, talk with us, because we can actually strategize around what this looks like for you and not just tell you what to do, right? There are some things that we do need to tell you what and how to do, but we want to hear that voice with you. We want to collaborate with you, because this looks completely different if we're talking to the volleyball team, or if we're talking to digital and social media, or if we're talking to facilities, or if we're talking to academics. And so our plan, the root of that plan is engagement. So I appreciate you all bringing that to the forefront. I'm going to transition to the next question. And I'm actually going to skip a question mainly because Yannick gave us a little bit of insight about the council and the Racial and Social Justice Council. If we have time, I'm going to circle back to it. But in the interest of time, I'll move to the next question. So for our panel, I would love to hear your thoughts on essentially what has been happening in a public setting. So we've seen a number of recent responses and developments in sport, nationally and internationally, whether it's around trans and non-binary athlete policies, protest policies like Yannick mentioned, and even boycotts. In your respective roles, give us a glimpse of how you work through this, whether that's individually or as an organization.
Okay, cool. And I'll go second.
First, I have to say that Leland and I were at the same conference last weekend, and every day I thought, wow, I love Leland's outfit. So it's a very timely question. And I'll just give one example. This happens on a lot of areas of our sport, but one big, I wouldn't say struggle, but concern that we're having right now is that our world championship for our age group athletes is taking place in Abu Dhabi. And so we're supportive of the LGBTQ plus community. So one of the challenges that we've had is, how do we work with our international federation to make sure that these athletes can go to another world championship? How can we make sure our athletes have the opportunity to be on a world team after they've, some trained for years or had to postpone it because of COVID? So that's a big issue for us. What we've ended up doing is deferring our own athletes. World Triathlon was not going to defer them, or not going to move the World Championship. So it's been a challenge. A lot of athletes have had confusion, like, I didn't claim my spot or pay my registration fee to go because I didn't feel safe going. I didn't know that, you would work with me to shift my registration to the next year. So that's a big challenge, especially when it's a little bit out of our hands. Like, we expressed to World Triathlon, we don't want our athletes going here. We don't support a government that, and I don't know if you're familiar with the laws in Abu Dhabi, but it's still punishable by death to be or to be gay or lesbian or transgender. So we don't want our athletes to be in that situation. So that's a challenge that we have to face on the world stage. And then obviously nationally, transgender athlete inclusion is a big topic right now. On the age group side, so our youth athletes, our recreational athletes, we implemented a policy we started in 2017 that is incredibly inclusive. So you can race as the gender you were assigned at birth, the gender in which you're in the process of transitioning to or have transitioned to, or in the gender in which you consistently identify as. We've also put in unlimited amount of times you can switch your gender if you identify as gender fluid. So for age group athletes, we've tried to make it as inclusive as possible. We decided that the benefits of sport participation in terms of recreation outweighs competitive fairness in the case of recreational athletes. So obviously right now when we're looking at our elite athletes, our NCAA athletes, we're having to weigh competitive fairness since it is that elite level. But that's a huge challenge that I imagine everyone up here has had to deal with a little bit in the last couple weeks.
Oh, sorry. Is this okay if I ask you a question directly? Just because, do you see that it's more important to try to boycott countries that aren't supportive of LGBTQ plus athletes, or is it working to work with them to start to support them? I know that's of course we all know what we'd rather, but how do you engage that? How do you engage international communities who are entire sovereign nations of themselves when it's coming to
For sure.
the sport? Yeah.
For sure. That's a great question. We've talked about it internally. We've talked about it with other national federations, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand. We kind of have joined forces on this. It's tricky. And so in terms of inclusion, we want to be inclusive of all of our athletes. So even our athletes who feel safe going to Abu Dhabi, we want to give them the opportunity to go. So we decided not to do a boycott, just to be inclusive of everyone's point of view. I'm going to pass the mic because
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we get that question all the time. And again, I don't know if I represent everybody's view, but for the approach to engage with folks who are not inclusive, to be successful, there has to be an ounce or just some willingness to learn and change. And the problem is with a lot of these the countries that have very anti-LGBTQ laws, it's just not there. So part of the paradox of doing inclusion work is that you can't include people who don't want to be inclusive. If you include them, just imagine, I mean, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I can't imagine going over there competing knowing that if I kiss my partner, I might be thrown into jail or killed. And that is a really stressful situation to be in. And at some point, you just got to say, there is no basis for dialogue here if you don't have at least an ounce of willingness to, change. That's a big part of the issue. And a lot of these topics are, they're not really about participation. They're really topics that are, fundamental human rights. Every person should be able to compete in a safe environment. And we don't even have to go as far as Abu Dhabi. I mean, in the United States, there are some populations that do not feel safe competing. I mean, not Leland and I are good friends. We go way back, but look what's happening in the Ivy League with Leah Thomas in swimming and some of the responses there. And that's, somebody who has earned their spot in the sport, and they are facing so much hate. And then you have to decide, well, do you engage with, the conservative hate groups of the world, or do you just have to say, we got to focus our resources on making sure our athletes are safe, they're protected, in case, the world comes at them.
Yeah, and even in the 2021 was the worst year for legislation in the United States for transgender. I mean, people in general, let alone athletes. I think it was over 40 states introduced transgender sport ban legislation, keeping children who are transgender out of public school sports. So it's, again, yeah, you don't have to go as far as Abu Dhabi. It's happening here, unfortunately.
I will echo these things, and 100% correct. And I think one of the things that we were faced with USA Cycling was we had an event in Chicago, right, where there were some protest happening on course on a situation that we own as far as the event that we had. And we were stuck between two things. So we were stuck between two CEOs, right? We have a new CEO, his name is Brendan Cork, just started January 1st of 2022. He's an incredible person. But what happened in the transition from our old CEO to our new CEO, there were some things that were said in the past that kind of, I called it stinking thinking type of thing, and didn't think very clearly about the things that were being said. So there was no reinforcement at that event for people to protest the way that they thought about transgender athletes, and we didn't do a good job at it. Okay, truth be told, we didn't do a good job at it around gaining access and helping people become very safe in that environment. So what we've included now is we have a policy in place now where we will not ever have anyone protest on our grounds based on any type of event that we put on because of USA Cycling, that we will not allow that to happen anymore. I think what we've had now is the ability to educate our leadership team on what to do and what not to do, and the promoters to do and what not to do, and the spectators to do or what not to do. So a lot of that education needed to happen. It just didn't happen soon enough. So we're fighting a good fight. This is a touchy situation, a touchy conversation to have with a lot of people. People have their own mindsets, and people wanna. People are very passionate about it, and certain things when people say, kind of come. See, this is, truth be told, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. This is hard for me to talk about because it's so personal to the individual, and how do you create a conversation to ensure that everybody's safe in the conversation? It's hard. It's very hard, and I'm not exempt from that. Okay, I've been at this work for 20 years, and it's super hard because you don't want to say the wrong thing. You just don't. It's tough. It's just tough.
I think you allude to just the challenge that when we're talking about equity and providing for others, it's always a challenge to meet the mark for every single person in every community. But we have to embrace that and not be distant to it. We have to embrace the uncomfortability of the conversations that we have when we're not using first-person language. We have to embrace the responsibility of understanding that we excluded someone because we used incorrect pronouns, and that has a prolonged effect. We have to understand that not allowing competition and or not basing our evaluative measures on our athletes with policies that are truly inclusive, that are not only inclusive policies that establish clear guidelines. We have to recognize that we have to at least continue not only working on that, but to commit to it and stand our ground on that. Specifically within our sport, the first thing you alluded to, Leah Thomas, and currently We also had an athlete in Minnesota that wore a Black Lives Matter swimsuit, and it was incorrectly disqualified for that. What we do is lean into the uncomfortability of these situations, wholeheartedly. We lean into it. One of my mentors once said, uncomfortability is just the first symptom of growth. And so when you recognize how uncomfortable you feel, lean in, not out. And so that's what we do. As an organization, when that happened, when we needed to start having conversations about the athlete in Minnesota, when we needed to start having conversations about policy, what we did was drop everything and we got together, we connected, and we actually listened to the populations, our transgender athletes. We also listened to medical experts. We also listened to social scientists. We also listened to the thought leaders in the space who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of those things were vital. And so it all started with listening, connecting, and trying to figure out how we could accept their needs, how could we accept everyone's needs, and then when it comes to providing, y'all, it's about just being honest and transparent. Because sometimes we just lack the transparency of we can't do that for you. Or we just can't figure it out, right? And somebody's better with us saying we can't do that or we can't figure it out than they are you just not giving them anything or not giving them any information, right? And so in that way, being extremely transparent as we can. And then lastly is trying to understand, have any of you heard of the great sports myth? It's coined by Dr. Jay Coakley. He's a sports scientist. Sorry, he was originally down the street. He's a professor emeritus at, I'm not even going to say it, Colorado State. And then he worked down at it still go bust for me. But with that, he coined the great sports myth, and what that says is sports is believed to be the space in which we say it's all about inclusion. And like, there's no color here. And like, right? And like, if you work hard enough, you'll get exactly what you want, right? That's a lie. How do I know it's a lie? There are people who are 4'10", and they really work hard at basketball. Let me tell you. They work hard. They in the gym every day. Sorry, you are not going to be LeBron. That's probably not going to make it to the NBA, right? So you can work as hard as you want. It's just not going to happen. That myth also goes further inside the sport to think that racism, that sexism, that ableism doesn't happen within the sport. But because we're all on the same level playing field and because we're working for each other, that somehow your identity or the things that you deal with in the world just kind of wither away. Sports is actually a microcosm of our society, and the problems that persist within our society are actually hyper-focused within sport. Sexism is worse in sport than it is in our society. Toxic masculinity is worse in sport than it is in our society. Racism is worse in sports. How does the black kid always end up on the line most of the time or playing running back and linebacker where they're bringing their brains more than anybody else? But somehow the kid that's the smartest on the field is always deemed the quarterback. You can't tell me it doesn't show up. It shows up. And so we have to understand that it's a great sports myth that we're living, and we're also having to unpack problems that exist within our worlds as well, and we have to be honest about that. Connect, accept, and provide honestly.
I think a lot of the confusion as far as, or like opposition toward transgender athletes comes from a lack of education. And so I wanted to ask here for obviously everyone that's in this room and then listening via Zoom, are there requirements in place at the amateur and professional level as far as measurements go to ensure that it is in some capacity a level playing field?
So the IOC had a policy that was longstanding, I believe about a decade. 2006 was when it was created. And in 2021, right around the November time, the IOC took the policy away, but they gave a framework for NGBs to then craft their own policies. Because they recognized that sports and NGBs, sports were different.
Leland.
And
Can you tell them what NGBs mean?
Yeah.
Oh, national governing bodies. So sorry, for national governing bodies for the sport. So USA Swimming is a national governing body for our sport. Cycling, triathlon, there's USA Basketball, there's track. So Frisbee, yeah. Archery. Missing that? Any other? Equestrian. There's fencing. There's so many, y'all. So boxing, a lot, okay? And we happen to work for just a fraction, again, of the Olympic movement as a total, right? A holistic movement. And so in swimming specifically, what we wanted to do first was understand the difference between social equity and competitive equity before like giving a policy. And so social equity is like, at the age group level, we recognize from the science and also leaning on medical doctors, we recognize that puberty, prepubescence level, that women or girls and boys actually were like right aligned in competition. And in some events, in swimming specifically, girls were faster than boys most of the time at a younger level, at the age group level. And so we made our policy actually more inclusive at the age group level. In which you just have to turn like a form. There's an online submission that you would have to make, and then you would just ask for your competition category to be changed. Because again, we didn't see the discrepancy like physically, and also we didn't see the discrepancy medically, scientifically on letting age group level compete.
So is that like 13U?
It's
U13?
It's really that it's 12 and under,
Okay.
13 and 14 where you can set records, which is the American record mark. Up, that's elite, as it pertains to USA Swimming.
Yeah.
So then at the elite level, when we're looking at post-pubescence, this is where, when we're talking about competitive equity, making it fair for all, this is where people in my office who aren't scientists, who aren't medical doctors, who aren't also trans, had to sit out of the conversation. We could not put our will and our understanding or misunderstanding of a subject onto a policy. So we stayed out of it. We gave it to the social experts. We also looked at, again, those who were trans. We also gave it to experts who were medical and scientific doctors. And they created a policy in which, for us, the transition is 36 months, 5 nanomoles of testosterone, and that's over a period of time, but that will be monitored by the medical staff and the scientific staff that we have. We have we have a group of doctors that will be working with athletes. However, I would be remiss to say, FINA, our governing body, they supersede all of our rules because it's international play. So we can talk about the American, but international play, they supersede. In the NCAA, we actually don't have anything to do with their rules at all. So I say all of that to simply say at the elite level, we have those policies in place, but our policy can change because we've allowed and even written into the policy, it can be amended once new information and better information is made aware. So our policy will always be shifting. We do not have a hard stop on what our policy is. It's just a start.
I'm just going to add quick on the age group side. So we actually have adult age group athletes in triathlon. Our median age is like 38. So it's very inclusive. We don't require testosterone levels for our age group adult athletes. Again, we looked at it and we did the same as swimming. Like we have a group that came together, transgender male, transgender female, parents of transgender athletes, female athletes, male athletes, coaches, medical experts. We decided that we wanted it to be as inclusive as possible for age group adult athletes. Sport has such a value in terms of the quality of your life. I think it's something like transgender people are 41% more likely to commit suicide. So if you can participate in sport as who you are, that may save your life. So that's the direction we took for age group. So our elite is still a little bit up in the air right now. We're following our international federation, who's still following the old IOC policy that's 10 nanomoles per liter. That will be changing soon. But yeah, and I think it's important too, like, just because, and I think this has not really come up enough in terms of the coverage of Leah Thomas, but I think, and we talk about it a lot in our office, that just because someone is transgender female does not mean that they're not allowed to win. You know, so if you're an age group athlete and you're a transgender female, you shouldn't be allowed to compete in sport as long as you don't win. Like, that's not inclusive. So just something to kind of chew on.
Yeah, I want to take, these are all good points. I want to take one step back, and you ask about, the education about trans issues, and I think part of the issue is that most people speaking on trans issues that are not experts like us, they don't know what they're talking about, just to be honest. They are raised a certain way, and they don't, it's beyond their imagination. I do want to say that, the policy reference, and I want to go back to the old policy, because this, to a certain degree, I do think that the new policy passed both by the IOC, the NCAA, and some of the NGBs, not just on the stage, but generally, are, I think, due to the public pressure that's been happening over the past 2 years, targeting specifically trans folks. So before that, under the IOC policy and the NCAA policy is actually modeled after the IOC one, you were able to compete as a trans woman if you've been on hormone replacement therapy for 1 year. So that was the mark, the 1 year. And once you've been on therapy for 1 year, you could compete, which Leah Thomas in the Ivy League has been, I think, on hormone for 2 years. So she even, she was beyond fulfilling the policy. I think the issue I have with the fairness argument that people say, it's not fair, is that the data just doesn't support that. The policy at the IOC level was passed in 2006. That's about 15 years ago. These past Tokyo Olympics were the first one where we even saw trans women compete, and they didn't get anywhere close to making the podium. So in the Olympic space, the data just doesn't support that idea that trans women are going to take over women's sports, which is a common talking point we see targeting trans individuals. At the college level, the NCAA has had the policy for trans women to compete since 2011, so about 10 years. Very few, examples where trans women are dominating the field. Leah Thomas, one of them, but this is, in 10 years, one athlete. So the data doesn't really support that, even that fairness argument in a lot of ways. So I think a lot of people, using that, they might be the ideology speaking more than the data that's out there.
Can I add one thing really quick? Sorry. This has been like my world for the last few weeks. One of the arguments that we hear a lot from people who don't have the background is that, well, what if like a man wakes up one day and they want to win, so they decide to compete with the women? And that doesn't happen. Like, we never see that. That is not something that we've ever seen. It's not that easy. You can't just like wake up one morning and decide, hey, today I'm going to compete as a female. So that is an argument we see a lot, that just, it doesn't happen, but it's what is being put out there. Also, so that is false.
No one would undergo that treatment. No. Like, just period. No one would undergo the disdain. Right. And so sorry. Like, it just seems, right? Like that, right. That's like, really? Like, who would want to undergo the downtrodden, disdain, difficult, right? Like, depressive, like, challenging path that statistically is proven that trans people will go through to win a medal? Like, to win a game that's going to be so short-lived that, like, the trauma and the adverse experiences that people go through, these women and men go through, will be living for the rest of their lives? Oh, cut it. It's laughable. It's really laughable to think that that could be a reason that someone would want to transition.
Thank you.
Great question, by the way.
For the interest of time, I'm actually going to transition to see if we have any questions from the Zoom. If you do have questions in person, please utilize the microphone as we mentioned. If there are any questions, no questions in Zoom? Okay, so I'll ask my last question and ask you all to give your closing thoughts. Oh, I'm sorry, go. We do have one question.
Oh, we know you.
Can everyone hear me? Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Jones. I am one of the students of Dr. Yannick from VCU. First of all, I just thank everyone from the key speakers today of just being here with us today and welcoming CU of VCU students. So it's been great being here. But my question really deals with inclusivity and just the intersectional identities of your athletes. And how do you all feel that NGB should address the various identities that these athletes have, and not just the sport they play and maybe the ability or disability that they have?
Who wants to take this first?
Coach's education for me I think it's coaches' education, and coaches have to not only be compassionate, but coaches have to be parents. At times, coaches have to be tutors. At times, coaches have to be confidants, mentors, right? And I know that's putting a lot on coaches. I know, because there's like a job that you have to do already, and I get that, and I really, really understand it. Because like I was an athlete, and I got on my coach's nerves all the times, but at the same time, Jim Trussell, who's one of the best athletic directors, best coaches, he would always say, and John Wooden, they would always say, "I'm a coach last, a father, a confidant, and a friend first." And so for me, it starts there because our coaches are the ones who are bestowing wisdom, bestowing even ideology, and even orientation to life with our kids. And more importantly, they're teaching them what to think, how to act, and they're teaching them skills of leadership, of like determination, and they have to be fervent about how they do that. And I know that to be true because I spoke to a student athlete within a sport that is not mine, and they had told me about the bad experiences that their coaches had given them, and how their coaches would tell them not to speak to certain athletes when they would go to trips, to stay away from certain athletes because they may steal your things, right? And that ideology then superseded and went throughout their lives as they were scared of black people, right? They were scared of the experiences that they had. And I keep hearing that recurring theme of athletes saying they are who their coaches are. And so I would start with coaches' education, and we just committed $2 million to an educational platform to teach our coaches things like inclusion, compassionate coaching, how to spot signs of abuse, grooming, and even technical development within the sport as well.
I'll piggyback on that one. So this is now dear to my heart, okay, because my background is in HR, so I'm a people person. So I think what you're saying is spot on. It's coaches have this ability to direct and engage people who don't know where to go. So it is the idea and understanding of coaches to create a clear pathway for athletes to be successful. Because it's not about the coach, it's about the individual. And I think there's where the rubber really meets the road, where most coaches that don't understand the impact that they have on people tend to find themselves, oh, it's about me, right? And it's not about you. It's not about you, it's about the individual. It's about who you're helping to try to help them grow. So one of the things I can say from what you're saying is it takes a craftsperson to educate someone to get to another level. Right? Especially with juniors. Oh, I can't tell you enough about juniors because they're going through this mindset that says they know everything, but at the same time too, they don't know anything. So it's the idea of the coach is to ensure that they're being able to direct a direction for them to be successful so that they can grow as young adults and really take the sport that they love in cycling and grow with it.
Really quickly, adding on both of those, coaching is spot on. I think a big piece is mentorship. So when we look at the intersectionality, so like a black female, having a mentor who is also a black female who's had similar experiences, it's invaluable. Like having someone that you can go to that is, you know, who looks like you, who maybe has the same background in the sport as you. I think that's super valuable in terms of the education piece, but also in terms of sustainability of your participation in the sport as a coach, as an athlete, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in terms of the intersectionality, the first thing you want to do is you want to be aware that that's a thing, which if you've graduated from VCU, you do. Good job. So you want to know that, you know, the experience of a gay white man is different than of a black gay man, and you want to be, you know, able to tell how and then identify strategies of how you can, you know, make both feel like they belong in the space. So you want to be aware that the way identities intersect have very, very different outcomes in the experiences of folks, especially those who hold minoritized identities.
Got time for 2 more questions.
If
First, thank y'all so much. I do want to say that our vice provost, acting vice provost, and our assistant vice chancellor is on the call right now for DEI, and she is like praising y'all so much. So I just want to tell y'all are doing a great job. I don't know, but I'm talking about Dr. B. Dr. B's in the chat going crazy for y'all. But my question is, how do you create and reinforce equitable policies when sometimes blatant racism kind of gets in the way? So the situation I'm talking about right now is Sha'Carri Richardson. I know y'all seen that all over social media or in the news. And she's claiming, in comparison of the Polish girl, that it's blatant racism and the fact that she couldn't compete and the Polish girl gets to compete.
I'll get us started. So one of the key components of a commitment to anti-racism is that there's no such thing as neutral policy. So a policy is either working towards or against racial equity. And Rule 50 that I mentioned earlier, the rule that says you can't protest during the Olympics, actually a perfect example because the rule actually has racially coded language in the rule that specifically targets racially minoritized folks like black athletes. So regardless of what policies you have, you always want to look at your policies and think about, okay, do they either nurture, racial, social justice, DEI, or do they represent a barrier? And I think, the example you referenced with Sha'Carri Richardson and the Russian figure skater who's white and who tested positive, the key difference is race. So and this is not surprising to people studying or engaging in Olympic spaces, that there is systemic racism, and that's one manifestation of it. So you want to make sure you look at what are the policies in place that allowed that to happen, and how can we change those to, for it to not happen in the future.
I have a kind of short response to it. I think it starts at the ground level. So like checks and balances when these policies are being developed is super important. Like there needs to be some sort of checks and balances. And I think I've been reading about this over the last few days. I think it's just wild, but some of the claims that are being made against age of the athlete, type of doping, I just think it's very unclear. So checks and balances when these are being developed.
I'll go a step further. All right, so currently right now we have an environment of people that are making the calls, right? So this is why this conversation is important. This is why it's important, because people who are hearing this type of knowledge and gaining this knowledge can help make those changes later in life. This is not a now thing, this is a later thing, right? So when those things happen, like you're talking about, these components that are happening today could not happen later because of the conversations that we're having now. So this is super important to engage these types of questions to gain some access and understanding of how to change the dialogue and the narrative around that.
One of my mentors said to me, you cannot legislate integrity, morality.
Who do you talk to? How many
Hey,
people do you know?
you cannot legislate morality. We're trying to legislate ethics. And I know we can't legislate ethics because of the OCR, Civil Rights Act of 1967, and look at where we are today. They tried to legislate, right? And so in that way, how can we solve systemic problems with individual efforts? In that, oh, you have a comment?
Yeah, go ahead. Really done. No, I can never tell. Sorry, I just want to mention, you're right, we can't legislate that, but I think the key piece here is too that if you look at the IOC, if you look at the World Doping Association, look at the people who are making the decisions, overwhelmingly looking like me, white, and male. They're probably straight, but they look like me. They're white men, and they are the ones doing, making the decisions. So, it's really important we increase that diversity at the very highest level of making decisions, because if there were a person of color in the room seeing that policy, they might have said, I don't like that this language is racially coded, where the white people be like, what do you mean, right? So that's one of the key pieces here, and I'll turn it back to Leland, because I know he's going to drive us home here.
Well, it's so perfect that you point that out, because the point of changing it is you can't do it individually. You have to create a system to change it. It has to be a system. You have to design a pipeline. It can't just be one person that you let into that room to look at the policies. It has to be 10. It has to be 20, right? It has to be 30. Like the one thing, and you look at the history of change within America, like holistically, the time that we've been able to get change from like the 1860s and the Emancipation Proclamation, and I do that sparingly. Also, 1967 Civil Rights Act, and even ADA acts that we got in the early 1900s, 1980s. The way that we got all of that change was by systemic efforts. Because we continue to point at systems and we say the system is the problem. But we, at sometimes don't realize that the system is just made up of people. The system ain't calling the shots. People are calling the shots who are in the system. Right? And so, not only do we have to remove those people from the systems, but just like in the 60s, just like in the 1800s, when we needed change, what do? Came and drove. We all showed up to be at that policy meeting. We all showed up on the national stage, right? With a certain type of fervent passion, with a certain type of angst that you didn't let us in, but we'll kick the door down, right? And that's what Juan Carlos did. That's what leaders do in the face of adversity and change when it needs to really happen. And so we can look at these policies and we can change them and we can try to incite change as much as we can. But again, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that someone would probably come back if the system isn't changed, if the people in the system isn't holistically changed, then someone will come and legislate another policy to go back 15 years. And isn't that happening in America right now? So, thank you for that question. That was amazing.
That is our time. Friends, colleagues, thank you so much for imparting your wisdom and your experience on us. A few closing things. For the student athletes that are in the room or on Zoom, please make sure you mark your attendance for the Austin education. If you see Ariana, please wave your hand. Deandra, please wave your hand. They're in my back left, your back right. You can go in and sign in with them so you can get your benefits. Last things I'll add as we close. One, things that we hope you took away. One, they're great people. I can vouch. Two, there's always this perception of what are we doing as DEI practitioners, and the one thing I would urge you to at least know at this point is there is countless hours of strategy that goes into it at every level, whether it's at the youth, intermediate, high school, college, pro, senior level. There are numerous hours of strategy that goes into it. So we ask that you please know that. In addition, Leland and I share a mentor, and Yannick for that matter. Dr. Catrice Albert, one thing she used to always tell us is this is hard work and hard work. It takes a lot of hard work to get this done, and you're really pouring your heart into changing people and policies. And lastly, I think I can speak for all the panelists that what we do is really, really important because we really wanted to change not just individual lives, but change the world. And so we try to pour our efforts into making sure that this world is better for the people coming behind us because we stepped into some things that we didn't want to step in, and we would make sure that poop is cleaned up before somebody else steps in it.
Can we give a hand applause, a hand clap for this guy? He's amazing.
Appreciate it. That actually concludes our keynote session. Panelists, again, thank you so much for being with us and, again, imparting your wisdom and your experience. For those on Zoom, we'll get started at the next session at 2 p.m. For those who are with us in person, you're welcome to stay in this room to participate in the next sessions or join us via Zoom. But we really appreciate you taking the time and effort and are very excited for you joining us today. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in the next sessions.